The wind was cold that morning, and the sea, though calm, seemed to whisper secrets no one wanted to hear. Thomas Whitaker, just 19, had never left the quiet hills of his family's farm in England. He dreamed of becoming a teacher. He wrote poems when no one was watching. And he loved his little sister Emily more than anything in the world. But the world had changed. In 1944, the call came, and like so many others, Thomas answered. The night before he left for France, he sat under the stars and wrote a letter. It was a promise to Emily, a promise to return, a promise he believed with all his heart. As dawn broke over the English coast, he boarded the ship with his unit, eyes scanning the gray horizon. Around him, other young faces carried the same quiet fear. Among them was Sergeant Andrew Bolton, older, wiser, a man who had seen things they hadn't. He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder and said only this, "Stay close to me, son." What happened next would change their lives and echo across generations. This is not just a story about a soldier, it's a story about love, promises, courage, and what we choose to hold on to, even in the darkest of times. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so that every memory, every voice, and every sacrifice lives on. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. The cold, salt air hit Thomas's face as he stepped onto the beach. But it wasn't the wind that took his breath away. It was the chaos. The sight that greeted him was beyond anything he could have imagined. The sea, once calm, was now a raging storm of red, churned up by the constant explosions. The sounds of gunfire, screams, and the pounding of artillery filled the air, deafening him. And all around him, his comrades, men just like him, were falling. Some tried to move, others could only lie still, their bodies scattered across the sand. He crouched behind an improvised wall of sandbags, his heart racing, the weight of fear pressing on his chest. Through the smoke and debris, he saw Sergeant Andrew Bolton, a man who had promised to watch over him, fall to the ground, struck by shrapnel. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The world around him slowed, but then everything rushed back. There was no time for hesitation. He had to move. Thomas pushed through the haze of confusion, his legs trembling as he sprinted across the open field, desperately trying to reach a fallen comrade. But the ground beneath him seemed to shift, as though the very earth was shifting to claim them all. He had barely made it a few steps when a sudden barrage of gunfire tore through the air. The pain was instant, a sharp, searing agony in his leg. Before he could react, his world went dark. The last thing he remembered was the sound of his own breath, shallow and frantic, before it all faded away. When Thomas finally came to, he felt the cold sting of the wet ground against his skin. His body was heavy, aching in places he didn't even know existed. His legs were tangled in the mud and his head was spinning. The war was still raging around him, but something was different. He wasn't on the beach anymore. He could no longer hear the screams of the men fighting for their lives. The sounds of war had faded, replaced by the quiet hum of nature. He tried to move but found himself too weak. His vision blurred, but through the haze he saw a figure, a soldier. He was alone walking toward Thomas, his uniform a stark contrast to Thomas's own. The man's face was worn, tired, and his eyes held something deep and understanding. Without a word, the soldier crouched next to him, offering a hand. Thomas didn't know what to think. The man was German, but in that moment, they were both just soldiers, caught in the same nightmare. There were no sides, no enemies, just two men, lost in a war neither of them had asked for. The soldier spoke softly, his voice thick with an accent Thomas couldn't place. "You will survive," he said, before disappearing into the woods, leaving Thomas to wonder whether it had all been a dream. But the encounter stayed with him. It was a reminder of something Thomas hadn't considered before. War wasn't just about fighting for a flag or a country. It was about survival, about reaching across the divide and seeing the humanity in others, even when everything around you told you not to. In the days that followed, Thomas limped through the war, each step a reminder of the horrors he had witnessed. But the memory of that soldier, the silent, fleeting connection they had shared, kept him going. He never saw the man again, but the lesson remained. Sometimes, in the darkest moments, there is still room for compassion, for understanding, for the simple, quiet humanity that connects us all. And so, Thomas carried that with him through every battle, through every hardship. Even when the world seemed too broken to repair, he held on to that one brief moment of peace, knowing that in the end, it wasn't the battle that mattered, it was the humanity we fought to preserve. His journey was far from over, but what he had learned on that fateful day on Omaha Beach stayed with him, a guiding light through the darkest hours of the war. Franz Müller never imagined he'd wear a uniform. At 28, he had been studying medicine at the University of Heidelberg, dreaming of healing people, not marching into battle. His hands were meant for saving lives, not holding a rifle. But dreams can be buried quickly in times of war. After his older brother was lost on the Eastern Front, Franz was called to serve, and this time there was no way out. He kept his head down, followed orders, did what he had to do. But inside, he was still the boy who once sat in quiet lecture halls, sketching anatomy charts and planning a future built on compassion. One gray afternoon in the hills of Normandy, Franz's patrol moved through the ruins of a village left in silence. Houses stood broken, windows shattered, streets littered with the echo of what used to be. The scent of ash and damp stone clung to the air. They were searching for survivors or threats, maybe both. And then he saw him, a young man barely conscious, lying face down in the mud behind a crumbled wall. British uniform, mud and dried earth on his face, a wounded leg, a faint breath. Thomas. Franz froze. The rules were clear. No mercy, no hesitation. Anyone found like this was to be reported, or worse. But something in Thomas's face made him stop. A softness, a calm. Maybe it reminded him of someone he once knew. Or maybe it was just the quiet cry of his own heart trying to speak louder than war. He looked around. His unit had moved ahead. He had a moment. Without a word, Franz dropped to his knees, checked the young man's pulse, and gently lifted him onto his back. He didn't think. He just moved. Past the shattered homes and into the edge of the forest, where an old stone cottage stood half-broken, hidden by vines and time. Inside it was dark and cold, but it was safe. He laid Thomas on a bed of rags and leaves, then went to work. Using pieces of torn cloth, a rusty needle, and a small pouch of herbs he kept hidden, Franz cleaned the wound and wrapped the leg. Every movement was careful, precise. He remembered his training, and for the first time in months, his hands felt like his own again. For the next 2 nights, the cottage became something it was never meant to be, a place of peace between two enemies. Thomas drifted in and out of sleep, murmuring names Franz didn't recognize, and Franz stayed close, whispering in German, even though he knew Thomas wouldn't understand. He wasn't speaking for him, he was speaking for himself. There was no food, only crumbs, no blankets, only dust. But there was silence, and in that silence, something began to grow, a strange, unspoken trust. Franz knew he couldn't stay. Sooner or later, his absence would be noticed, and if he was caught, the consequences would be final. But before he left, he made a choice. He placed a folded note near Thomas's chest, written in simple English, "You're safe. Don't move until night. There is kindness left in this world." Then he vanished into the trees. Thomas never saw his face clearly, only the memory of quiet hands, the warmth of cloth on a wound, and the gentle voice that kept him breathing through the pain. Years later, when Thomas told this story to his granddaughter, he called him the silent soldier, a man who chose mercy over orders, who walked away from hate even when the whole world marched toward it. Some heroes wear medals, others vanish into the fog, remembered only by those they chose to save. And Franz? He never made it home, but his oath lived on, in the life he saved and the peace he gave, if only for a moment. The cottage stood like a forgotten ghost, walls cracked, roof half collapsed, dust thick over everything like snow untouched for years. But within that silence, surrounded by war and ruin, something unexpected was born, a fragile pact. Thomas awoke with a sharp breath, his leg aching and his mind foggy. His first instinct was fear. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't safe. And the man watching over him wore gray. But Franz didn't move. He sat in the corner, calm, his rifle nowhere in sight. In broken English, he spoke slowly, almost apologetically. "I don't want to fight," he said. "I just want to go home." Thomas didn't answer at first. He wasn't sure if it was a trap or if he was simply too tired to care. But something in Franz's voice, low, steady, honest, cut through the fog. And in that broken-down room, where the wind whistled through shattered windows, the silence between them became less of a threat and more of a bridge. Over the days that followed, they shared what little they had, a few raw potatoes from a garden long forgotten, water caught in rusted tins from the rain, no fire, no comfort, just two men, strangers, surviving one breath at a time. But what they truly shared couldn't be held in their hands. Thomas spoke of Emily, his little sister, with the laugh that echoed across their farm, and the poems he used to write under the barn roof, where no one could find him. He spoke softly, as if saying the words out loud would bring those memories closer. Franz, in turn, spoke of his mother's bakery in the heart of Heidelberg, of warm bread at sunrise, of the woman he loved, who wore a red scarf every winter and kissed him goodbye at the train station, promising to wait. They didn't understand each other perfectly, but it didn't matter. Sometimes a name was enough, a memory, a smile in the middle of fear. At night, the house seemed to breathe with them. The wooden beams creaked gently, and the wind carried whispers through the cracks, echoes of laughter, footsteps long gone, voices of the past trapped in its stone. It was as if the house remembered what peace once felt like and chose to protect them, even for a short while. Neither of them knew how long it would last. Every sound outside could mean discovery. Every sunrise could be the last they'd share. But each morning, Thomas would open his eyes, see the shape of Franz by the window, and know one simple truth. In a world torn apart by chaos, this broken place had become a sanctuary. Not because it was safe, but because inside it, two enemies had chosen to see each other as something more than uniforms. As men, as sons, as human. On the sixth night, the sky trembled with distant echoes. Far off, the ground rumbled as if the world itself were breaking apart. But inside the crumbling stone house, it was a different kind of battle that unfolded. Thomas was burning with fever, his face pale, his lips dry. He tossed and turned, caught in the grip of memories and dreams. His voice cracked as he whispered for his mother, over and over, like a boy lost in a storm. Franz stayed beside him the entire night. He held Thomas's hand, steady and calm, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth and whispering words of comfort in German that Thomas couldn't understand. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that someone was there. Someone stayed. When morning finally broke through the cracks in the wooden walls, something between them had changed. That moment, silent, painful, and deeply human, sealed a bond stronger than any spoken agreement. They were no longer just two men on opposite sides of a battlefield. They were something more, something rare. That same night, under the soft flicker of a candle, their words began to flow. Not forced, not planned, just honest. Franz broke the silence first. His voice trembled, but he didn't stop. He spoke of Poland, of a terrible day he could never forget. He had been ordered to stand in a line, rifle in hand, beside others. He didn't want to be there. He didn't want to obey. But fear is a heavy thing. And when it ended, something inside him had gone quiet, a part of his soul he hadn't been able to reach since. "I see it every night," he said, "even with my eyes open." Thomas didn't speak for a long time. Then with a deep breath, he looked at the candlelight and shared his own story. His father had marched off to fight in the Great War when Thomas was just a baby. He never returned. His mother raised him and Emily alone, always telling him that peace was worth fighting for, but that war itself was never a solution. "I swore I'd never wear a uniform," Thomas whispered. "Swore I'd never step into the same footsteps that stole my father." He looked at Franz and they both knew. Life had taken choices from them, replaced dreams with orders. And yet, in the middle of it all, they had found each other. Their confessions didn't create distance. They didn't cast blame or breed shame. Instead, they built a bridge, a quiet understanding between two broken men, haunted by different memories, wounded by different ghosts, but walking through the same storm. In that fragile shelter between candlelight and crumbling walls, the war outside continued to rage. But inside, two hearts found something the world had forgotten how to give: forgiveness, understanding, and the first bricks of trust where once there had only been walls. By the seventh day, the quiet no longer felt safe. Distant footsteps echoed through the trees. Shouted orders bounced off the ruined buildings of the nearby village. The Allies were coming. Franz knew what it meant. His time in that fragile shelter was over. If his own army found him, he'd be branded a traitor. If the Allies caught him, they'd see only the uniform, not the man behind it. Either way, the walls were closing in. Thomas, now strong enough to walk with a limp, sensed it too. He stood near the broken window, watching the smoke from distant fires curl into the morning sky. "They're close," Franz said, barely above a whisper. Thomas turned to him, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "Then come with me." Franz blinked. "What?" "Come with me. Surrender. I'll speak for you. I'll tell them what you did, what you didn't do. They need to hear it." Franz hesitated. Everything in his training screamed against it. Surrender wasn't survival, it was shame. But as he looked into Thomas's eyes, he didn't see pity. He saw something else: belief. With a slow nod, Franz agreed. He took nothing with him, just the same uniform that had once made him invisible, now marking him as the enemy. Together they moved carefully through the woods, following a narrow path that led to the main road. And then, voices, footsteps. British soldiers emerged from the trees, rifles raised in an instant. "Hold fire!" Thomas shouted, stumbling forward, arms out wide. "He's with me!" Franz froze, his hands rising slowly into the air. Among the soldiers was a young man, barely older than Thomas, named Peter Grant. His hands shook as he aimed. His finger tightened on the trigger. Thomas stepped between them. "He saved me!" he cried, his voice cracking. "Please, don't do this!" The forest held its breath. Peter looked at Franz, then at Thomas, then at the tears running down Thomas's face. Slowly, painfully, he lowered his weapon. Franz was taken into custody. The soldiers tied his hands, but gently. No blows, no shouts, no revenge. Because of Thomas. Because of a story that defied what uniforms were supposed to mean. Later, when questioned, Thomas told the truth about the stone house, the rainwater and raw potatoes, the fever, the confessions, the silence that had turned into something human. And Franz? He was no longer just a name on a list. He was the man who chose kindness over orders, who carried a stranger to safety, who stayed. He was, in the eyes of one British soldier, not an enemy, but a friend who had walked through fire beside him. And on that road where war could have ended everything, it gave them something instead: a second chance. After that day in the woods, Franz Müller was no longer a ghost hiding in shadows. He was a prisoner of war. They took him to a camp in the south of England, surrounded by fences and guarded watchtowers. The days were long, the nights longer. He was questioned again and again. His accent, his past, the choices he made, all under the cold light of suspicion. Thomas did everything he could. He wrote reports, gave statements, told anyone who would listen that Franz had saved his life, that he had risked everything to protect a wounded enemy. But the war machine didn't care much for compassion. Paperwork moved slowly, and mercy had no place in the margins. Months passed, the war ended, the world began to rebuild, and Franz was quietly sent back to a country he barely recognized. He arrived in Germany with nothing but a small bag of belongings and the memories of a stranger who had once seen him as more than a uniform. His home in Heidelberg was gone, reduced to ash and rubble. His family, gone too. No mother's arms to welcome him, no bakery on the corner, just silence. With nowhere to go, he wandered. Days became weeks. Eventually, he found work tending gardens at a convent on the edge of a forest. It was quiet there. The nuns asked no questions. The flowers didn't judge. He rarely spoke of the war, never mentioned Thomas by name. But in his small room, tucked in a wooden box beneath his bed, he kept a piece of cloth folded with care. It was a handkerchief, worn, faded, and still carrying the scent of another life. Stitched into the corner, in soft blue thread, was a single name: Emily. It had been a gift, a token of gratitude, handed to him by Thomas in the final hours before their parting. "For what you did," Thomas had said, placing it gently in his hand. "If I don't make it, remember her. Remember us." Franz did. Through the seasons, through the silence, through the years of planting and pruning, he never forgot. He often wondered if Thomas had made it home, if he had seen his sister again, if he'd ever spoken of the soldier in gray who became his friend for a brief moment in the fire of war. But no letters came, no word, no news. So Franz held on to the only proof that those days had ever happened, a small piece of fabric and the memory of a boy who had once stood between him and a bullet. And though the world moved on, though time tried to bury the past in layers of dust and distance, Franz never let go. Because some promises are never spoken aloud, some bonds don't fade, and some stories, no matter how quiet, live on in the hearts of those who carry them. Life moved on, as it always does. After the war, Thomas Whitaker traded his rifle for a chalkboard. He became a teacher, the kind that read poetry aloud and never raised his voice. He married a kind woman named Margaret, built a quiet home, and raised 2 children who knew him as a gentle father with tired eyes and a faraway gaze. But even as the world healed around him, a piece of his heart stayed behind, in a ruined cottage in Normandy, beside a man who had once been his enemy and became something much more: Franz. Thomas never forgot him, not the quiet hands that had kept him alive, nor the way he disappeared into the trees with nothing but hope and silence. Every time he looked at the scar on his leg, he remembered the warmth of that makeshift bandage. Every time he looked at the stars, he remembered the nights they shared, whispering stories in the dark. He tried over the years to find him: letters, inquiries, visits to old comrades who might have heard something. But no one knew where Franz had gone. Some said he had vanished. Others assumed the worst. And eventually life became louder than memory, but not forever. In the early 1970s, Thomas retired. The classroom emptied, the papers stopped piling up, and the noise of everyday life gave way to the quiet truth he had been carrying for decades. He had made a promise, not in words, but in the look they shared on that last day. A promise to never forget, a promise to find him if life allowed. And so, the search began again, this time slower, but with more heart. He wrote to archives, traveled to libraries, asked questions no one had answered in years. Some called it foolish. Some said the past should stay buried. But Thomas believed that some bonds, those forged under fire and silence, deserved more than just memory. In 1984, after nearly 4 decades of wondering, a name surfaced. An old field medic, long retired, replied to one of Thomas's many letters. He remembered a German prisoner, quiet, polite, who had once worked in a retirement home in Hamburg. He had gone by Franz. No last name, but the way he spoke, the sadness in his eyes. The medic never forgot him. That was all Thomas needed. Without telling his family, he packed a small bag, bought a train ticket to Germany, and began the final leg of a journey that had started on a beach soaked in fire and fear. He didn't know what he'd find. He didn't even know if Franz was still alive. But in his chest, beneath the years and the silence, that old promise still burned. And some promises, especially the ones made between 2 men who survived what they were never meant to, can't be broken. Not by time, not by distance, and not by silence. It was a cold morning in November when Thomas arrived at the care home in Hamburg. The sky was gray, the air sharp with the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. He stepped through the iron gate with slow, careful steps, his heart pounding like it had on the beaches of Normandy all those years ago. And then he saw him. In a quiet corner of the garden, bent over a rose bush, was an old man in a faded coat. His hair was white now, his back curved. But there was no mistaking the way he moved, the gentleness in his hands, the patience in every touch. Franz. Thomas didn't call out. He didn't need to. Something inside him cracked wide open, and tears came before he could stop them. Warm, unstoppable tears that carried decades of waiting. Franz looked up. Their eyes met, and time vanished. The garden faded. The noise of the world fell away. The years between them crumbled like the walls they had once hidden behind. Franz dropped his pruning shears, and without a single word they walked toward each other, arms opening, hearts racing. They embraced like brothers lost to war and found by something greater than memory, something unbreakable. The nurses watched from the windows, frozen by the sight. Two old soldiers, once enemies by uniform, now held together by a bond few could understand. They didn't speak for a long time. They didn't have to. But when the words finally came, they flowed like rivers long held behind stone. They talked for hours in the sunroom, side by side in two wooden chairs. They shared stories they thought would never be heard. They laughed even when their voices trembled. They cried too, because some pain never leaves. It only becomes quieter with time. Thomas reached into his coat and handed Franz a small, worn notebook. Inside were his poems, those he had written under the barn roof, and others scribbled in the dark corners of war, when he still believed he might not make it home. Franz opened the pages with trembling fingers. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. Then slowly he stood and crossed the room to a drawer by his bedside. From it, he pulled out a carefully folded piece of cloth, soft, fragile, still marked with time. He handed it to Thomas. It was the handkerchief. Emily, stitched in blue thread, still intact, still sacred. "I kept it," Franz whispered, "every day." In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the uniforms they had once worn, not the sides they had once stood on. All that remained were two men who had walked through the fire and found each other again after a lifetime of silence. And in that embrace, under the cold sky of a quiet German garden, they proved to the world that even after war, peace is possible, that even after loss, love endures, and that some promises are never forgotten. Years passed, and time, as always, kept moving forward. Franz lived out his final days in quiet peace, surrounded by gardens and silence. He never sought recognition. He didn't speak of what he had done. But in his heart, he carried the memory of a moment that had changed everything, of a choice made not with orders, but with humanity. Thomas, older now, with silver in his hair and a tremble in his hands, knew his own journey was nearing its end. One autumn, with his daughter and young grandson beside him, he returned to the place where his life had been saved, not just by medicine, but by mercy. The stone cottage was still there, though time had worn it down to its bones. Ivy crept across the walls. The wind whispered through the open door. But to Thomas, it was sacred ground. He walked slowly, each step echoing with memories, and knelt by the ruins. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small glass bottle, sealed with a note inside. The handwriting was shaky, but the message clear. Even between fear and the unknown, there is still space for forgiveness. He placed the bottle on the windowsill, beside a bundle of fresh wildflowers. Then, looking up at the gray Normandy sky, the same sky they had both once feared, he smiled. His grandson, eyes wide and heart full of questions, stood quietly by. That day, he didn't fully understand what had happened in that house. But years later, he would. He grew up with the story, passed down in whispers, shared in quiet moments at the kitchen table. And when the time came, he wrote it down. Not as a tale of war, but as a testament to something far greater, the power of compassion. The book reached thousands, and eventually millions. People across the world read about two soldiers, one in green, the other in gray, who chose to see each other not as enemies, but as men, as human. And so the story of Thomas and Franz became something more than memory. It became a symbol, a reminder that in the darkest corners of history, there are still moments of light, that even when the world is falling apart, small acts of kindness can leave a mark that outlives war, politics, and time itself. This story isn't just about the past. It's about the choices we make every day, to see the person behind the uniform, to listen instead of judge, to reach out even when everything tells us to turn away. Did you already know this story? What would you have done in Thomas's place? What other stories of soldiers, friendship, and redemption deserve to be told? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Every voice helps keep these memories alive. And if this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Leave a like, share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a chance to hear another story like this. Stories that remind us of who we are and who we can still become. Until next time, carry the legacy, keep the memory alive, and never stop believing in the light that can grow, even in the shadow of war.